Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and welcome to another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, it's our weekly look at the wonderful world of books, books that I've read, and people that I've interviewed about their books. Yeah, authors and everything come all on this, folks. So, you don't want to miss one of these episodes. And today we are joined by Ruby McConnell. She comes to us from Eugene, Oregon. She's written an absolutely spectacular book called Wilderness and the American Spirit. It's a nonfiction book. It is well done. It is well researched. She tells us all about things such as the Humboldt Sink, the Applegate Trail, their importance to the development of America. We're going to learn about how the beaver played a big part in the development of America. And we're going to learn all about famous people, or maybe sometimes infamous people, who lived on the trail. Again, this is a book about the wilderness. It's a book about America, the open spaces, the land, the air, and everything that we have and we breathe. And I'm going to tell you what, this was one lovely, lovely young lady who I had a chance to meet with, and I think you're going to really enjoy her interview. So let's sit back and enjoy this, and I think you're going to really learn something about the wilderness and the American spirit. Ruby, welcome to Books and Looks.
Hi, nice to be here.
Well, Ruby is the author of a new book called Wilderness and the American Spirit. It is a very, very well done book. It's a nonfiction book. And I'm telling you, I learned so much reading this book. The minute I finished this book, I think back in November and December when I got it early. I've been waiting for this for 3 months to talk to you. So I'm very excited. Um, Ruby, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? I think so there's some Irish, some Australian. Tell us a little bit about yourself and growing up.
Sure. I grew up in Oregon. I was born in Oregon. Grew up in Portland, which is about 2 miles north of Eugene. And I'm the daughter of immigrants. My dad is from Northern Ireland. My mom's from Australia. And I went to Lincoln High School in Portland, which is where Gary Snyder, the poet Gary Snyder, went to high school, and also Matt Groening, who created The Simpsons. Got a great education there and did my college work at the University of Oregon and fell in love with Eugene and moved back. And
There
I've
you
been here ever
go.
since.
Now, when you went to college, what did you major in? And I think you got advanced degrees also, don't you?
Yes. So I did my undergraduate work in geology and environmental studies, and then I did a master's degree in geology with an emphasis on active hazards and volcanology, and went and worked in hazards geology for a few years after that, and groundwater and soil contamination.
Wow, that's really interesting. Geology. What made you go into geology, Ruby?
Well, I was an environmental studies and general science major, and I had this amazing graduate student come in. A professor was sick, and she came. This PhD student was covering, and she came in and she talked about how she had been a welder, um, and had questions about materials, had questions about like metals and what was going on that she couldn't get answered, and that she had this craving for. And she talked about the experience of becoming a researcher in what was then a very male dominated field, and invited girls in the class to young women in the class to come and talk to her. And she hooked me up with a wonderful professor who became a mentor, and that mentor came to me one day and said, I have a project on Mount St. Helens. And in this part of the world, when you're studying volcanoes, Mount St. Helens is a big deal. This is like a big, and it's part of, when you grow up in Oregon, it's part of, like the folklore of being of my generation in Oregon. And she said, I have this project on Mount St. Helens, and I want to give it to you, but I'm not going to give it to you if you don't become a geology major. You need to be a geologist for this. You have to change your major. And so I did. And it was a really good decision. And it changed everything about the way I see the world, and the way I engage with the world, and I think it's a real testament to what good mentorship can do.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Now, you said at the time there were not that many women going into geology. Has that changed at all since the time you were in college?
It really has, actually. It's really been, an extraordinary shift, and I think that that is almost entirely due to the efforts of the few women that got a foothold in like the 70s and the 80s, and got tenure, and then really worked hard to provide not just research opportunities but funding opportunities, and making sure that like the doors that they had kind of kicked open, they then held open for younger generations, and it's been really an exciting transition, to watch. When I was a working geologist, I arrived on site one day. I mean, I was maybe 5 years into my career, and the driller pulled up, and it was a woman, and we jumped up and down for 10 minutes because we just never experienced it to have both the geologist and the driller on a site be women. We thought it was nuts. It was a great day, and I think that that's common now. I think more common.
Every geologist I met, and now you're the third, has all been a woman. I've never met a male geologist. So, yeah, interesting. Maybe we have to get the men back into the field. I'm not sure, but wow, well, that's great. Now, this is your fourth book, if I'm not mistaken, and it's a little maybe be more, but I mean that I'm aware of. There are four. Uh, how does this differ from all your other books? I think it is a little bit different.
It is different. My first 3 books, there was my first book was A Woman's Guide to the Wild, and it was prescriptive nonfiction, and really was, designed as like a how-to, um, to be successful and to kind of shape your relationship to the outdoors. And the Girl's Guide and the little activity book that came with that were similar, but for a middle grade audience. And then Ground Truth was personal essays, and that came out during the pandemic, and it was very place based, and it was creative nonfiction. So in that respect, it's quite similar to Wilderness and the American Spirit, and it's the same publisher, as well. But Wilderness and the American Spirit is, a little bit more removed from personal experience. I tried, to take myself much farther out of it because I was trying to write from the standpoint of the every person, because I think that the themes that I deal with in the book, are themes of the collective. And so I wanted to create a sense of community in the experience of reading the book. And then also, it uses a really unique narrative structural form where, instead of sort of straight narrative through, I do sort of an alternation between what I call storytelling chapters and exposition chapters, things that are more designed to give background and context to the story that I've just told in the previous or upcoming chapters.
It's very good. I love it. I love those little short things that get you hooked and keep. Oh, I gotta read the next one. I can't put it down, you know. And it was like I said, I got this book so long ago, and I couldn't wait to finish it and then talk with you about it. It's a wonderful book, and friends, it's an easy to read book, very easy to read. And one of the things you talk about is the title. Well, no, wait. Before the title, we got to get to the cover because the cover's spectacular. How did you come up with that cover?
I can take, literally zero credit for that. Z- Zero credit. In fact, probably even less than zero credit, because I think I was actually advocating for something that is opposite of how it turned out. But I agree with you. It is genius. It is beautiful artwork. It's exactly what was needed. Um, my idea was not as good as this, and it's a testament to good publishers and to good editors and to having a really great team. So my team at Overcup had a vision for this, and they took it to, an artist called Cole Gerst, that they have worked with on a lot of their books. They make beautiful books, and I think that his vision was really spectacular. And it's always an honor when another artist so clearly elevates your work with their own, and I think that that's what's happened here. And I'm just really grateful for that.
It's very well done. With the title, was that always gonna be your working title, Wilderness in the American Spirit, or did that get changed a little bit also?
That was always the title. The whole book comes from that title. There's a fundamental, environmental book that came out in the mid-20th century, um, called Wilderness in the American Mind, and it was much more academic, and it set a lot of the it did something similar to what I did, which it sort of took the American relationship to the wilderness through time, and really presented it in a 20th century context. And so that title is sort of reflecting that we're in a new millennia, and we have a new relationship. We're in a new era for the environmental movement, and so the title sort of reflects that shift. And it's meant in a patriotic, it's meant in all the sort of ways. Yeah.
Good, good. Alright. Now, wilderness. Do you, as an author and as a scientist, define that word differently than I might define the word wilderness or what we think of as wilderness?
Yeah, everybody defines wilderness differently.
Okay. How do you define it?
I think that I define wilderness as places that I go where I myself feel of the wild, and where I myself have a sense of, being outside of the built environment. But there's legal definitions, and there's historical definitions, and there's problematic definitions, and there's emerging definitions. And I think that, and I think that yeah, it's complex in a modern world. I think that wilderness is complex and diminishing.
Okay, let me ask this question now. And does wilderness always mean a lot of trees? Because that's when I think of wilderness, it's always mountains and streams. But I mean, would we take a look at things like the Grand Canyon and we look at, or Bryce Canyon, is that a wilderness also?
Yes. And I love that you say the Grand Canyon. I did my graduate studies at Northern Arizona University, which is just it's practically on the
Yeah,
rim
right,
of the Grand Canyon.
right. Home of the
And so I
lumberjacks,
spent
I'll
I
tell
spent a
you.
lot of the lumberjacks.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
One of my
amazing. So
one of my best friends in law school went to Northern Arizona for his undergrad, so I knew all
it's a
about the
great school.
lumberjacks. Yeah.
It is a great school, and part of what makes it great, when you're a geology, student, is it's got world-class geology. I mean, you cannot beat the stack of rocks that you get to study living by the Grand Canyon. And, so I backpacked the Grand Canyon to do, field work every 6 weeks while I was in graduate school. And, it is absolutely a wilderness. And what's interesting is that it's one of the most remote feeling places I've ever been to, even though sometimes vertically, you're only maybe half a mile from, a parking lot, but you're so far away from that if it snows, and you
Oh,
can't get
yeah,
out or
yeah.
something
Mhm.
happens. So it's really, but I like that question. I like that question.
And if you wanna get from the one side to the other side, you gotta go all the way around. It takes around 5 hours.
Yeah.
I remember
Or you can
doing
go
that.
down and through. You can
Uh-huh,
go.
yeah. Okay, if you see me, we're not going down and through. Nearly died doing doing a hike on Zion, on top of Zion National Park, nearly died. Oh my god. And they kept telling me, "Oh, it's the easy guide, it's the easy trail." Yeah, right, easy trail. Yeah, yeah. My
It's all
daughter
relative.
oh, yeah, my daughter, who I think was around 7 or 8, she splayed out all over across the rock, she can't move. "Carry me, daddy, carry me." "No, no, Sarah, you do it yourself. I'm having a hard time carrying myself." So, oh my. Okay, so yeah, because I think of wilderness, I gotta be honest with you, I think of the West. We do have the Blue Ridge area here, we do have the Smoky Mountains. There's something about the West. There's something about the West and the wilderness and the being out there with nature. It just it inspires you. It really does. It makes you feel different when you're out there with it.
Yeah, and I love that observation. I love that you say that. I was banking when I wrote this book on the fact that when people think about wilderness, they think about the West. And that's why I chose to set it in the West, because I think it's something that, yeah, Americans, I think our concept of wilderness largely lies westward.
Mhm. 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 Well, your book has got some interesting parts dealing with people I've never heard. Well, I sort of heard of them, but I didn't know anything about them. Like this guy named Humboldt and the Humboldt sink. What is the Humboldt sink? And tell us a little about this gentleman by the name of Humboldt that they named the sink after.
Humboldt was a scientist and a philosopher, and he and a geologist and a botanist and an explorer, and he in the sort of early expansionist era of the United States history was sort of, in that first wave of scientists to go ocean faring and very Darwinian, sort of going and collecting information and mapping. And he invented or conceived of uh, a, a, a a cosmology of the universe in which things, nature and humans and the greater cosmos were interconnected and interdependent on one another in a way that people had never really conceived of the world before. It was a shift in worldview, um, much like people might have experienced as we sort of started to figure out that maybe we weren't the center of the solar system. There's kinds of large scale, and so as Humboldt did this and was putting together his cosmology, um, he was publishing books and becoming famous over the course of many sort of decades as his works were translated, and people started naming places, sometimes places that he had never even been, in the case of the Humboldt Sink, after him. And so the Humboldt Sink it's in Nevada and it's in the middle of the desert. It's actually very close to where they hold Burning Man, and as a reference point for people. And it's so it's interesting because it's called the Humboldt Sink, presumably because something about the nature of the landscape inspired the people who named it to consider Humboldt's cosmology in a way that's interesting when we think about wildernesses, being trees. This is a place that is devoid of trees and devoid of water most of the time, and yet is complicated because it does have intermittent rains and it does suddenly become a vast waterscape. And it's a place where survival is really at the forefront of the experience of living things, and it's also where immigrants west in the wagon road days would sort of reach a divide and a decision point in where they were going to branch off from their straight westward journey, either north into the Pacific Northwest or south into California.
Okay, what sank in the sink? It's called the Humboldt sink, but what sunk? I don't know. What does that mean?
The water, so the reference is it's a massive basin, right? And so I think that the reference is to sort of the way that the water drains out of that arid
Okay,
basin.
all right,
Yeah.
okay. Shows you my knowledge, folks, of geology.
Could be
Oh
could be
my.
anything. It's
The
how would you
Humboldt thing.
know?
I wouldn't know. The thing is, I remember Humboldt from, and I don't know if it's still called that, but there was a school in California called Humboldt State University,
Yes.
which I
Yeah.
which I I think is also named after this gentleman.
Same guy. Yeah,
Same
there's all
guy.
sorts of stuff
Okay.
named
Yeah.
after him.
There
Same
you
guy
go.
all over the country, and he only came to the United States once. It just shows, like how influential, like it's kind of it's hidden, this influence, but he really was important in our concept of the universe.
That's neat. That's really neat.
Yeah.
Now, you got a couple of references here that just get me. I love this one. We move across, America's moving across the continent. Now, folks, we're talking about the 1700s, 1800s here, it's probably 1700s. And we're going across the country, and we're going across lands that have been claimed by, I think, England and Spain and France. And then we get to the beaver. And supposedly the beaver did as much to ruin the environment. And not that it wasn't them ruining it, but it was because of the Europeans. Tell us, I never correlated that, Ruby.
So so there was a conundrum, when the colonial powers first arrived to North America. There was an accessibility thing that was okay. I mean, it wasn't okay. It was hard sailing, and then you land on, but at least once you arrived, you were there. And they sort of pushed west. And at some point, you know, it's a really long ways to get all the way to the Pacific Northwest, but they were still disputed territories. And so they had to, rather than hand-to-hand combat, which was, sort of how things, were dragging cannonballs, however warfare was playing out at that time, there weren't enough people in the West to wage a war, and there weren't enough people to kind of properly claim them for any colonial power. And so one of the things that they did was sort of say, well, let's just discourage people from arriving for a little bit as a means of maintaining at least economic control, because the Hudson Bay Company was there, if not establishing political control down the line. And so one of the things that they did was they thought, well, people, women like these women, these Eastern women in these fancy cities, like they love themselves some beaver pelt. Like these women cannot get enough, and the men and their hats, and they are into these beaver pelts. And they thought, well, we're just gonna hunt all these beaver and and make all the hats in the universe so that people will not think that it's a good idea to come out and establish, like a beavery, whatever it might be. And like not be drawn out by the possibility of making money off of these beaver. So we'll just kill all these beaver first, and then there won't be any reason
Right.
to come out here.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
So the
it kind
simple
of
be
worked for a little while.
yes, it did. Yeah, the beavers, it did. Wow. Now you get me to another place. I never heard of this. Applegate, the Applegate Trail. Now, I've never heard of this. Again, I'm so at a loss for this stuff. But tell me, who were the Applegates? How did the trail get named after them? And why do you think we've never heard of them? At least those on the East Coast have never heard of Applegate. Well, tell us a little bit about the family.
I mean, I love that you ask those questions because I had all those same questions. That's how I ended up writing this book. Because I didn't know who the Applegates were either. And my experience was of, I spend a lot of time sort of on back roads and traveling, and because I'm out and about. And after I moved down to Eugene and I started exploring further south in Oregon, there were all these signs that were marking the Applegate Trail. And they're just all over the place. And they're like California Trail, Applegate Trail, Applegate Trail, Applegate Trail interpretive sign. And finally I went, what's the Applegate Trail? And I started following the signs, and it didn't actually become immediately clear. And that's intriguing and that's interesting. And so I followed the thread, and it turns out that the Applegates are these three brothers that came out from Missouri in the 1840s with the first major wagon train to head west. And they made it out to Oregon. They established homesteads. They participated in setting up the provisional government for Oregon and the Northwest Territories. And they had lost family on the journey out west on the Columbia River, which is the largest river in the Pacific Northwest. And that tragedy made them feel very determined that there had to be a better, safer route than the one that took the river. And eventually, when the United States government thought, well, maybe this beaver thing isn't working so much and we need to be able to send military out, they thought maybe another road would be good too. And they chose the Applegates to chart that road heading from Oregon out to what eventually was the Humboldt Sink and Fort Hall, which was another major wayfaring point on the original trail. And so they established um, a a southern immigrant route into Oregon. That I mean, it's an amazing trail. They were incredible surveyors. They were incredibly talented men. They were incredibly hardworking and brave. And portions of that trail became the most heavily used immigrant trail west when just a few years later they found gold in California. And all of a sudden at Fort Hall, instead of heading north into Oregon country, everyone started taking the southern route into California. And it's still, the Applegate Trail is still um, a major a series of major roadways through the American West. I mean, the I-5, the major interstate of the West Coast, follows the Applegate Trail. It's really an incredible feat.
How long is it, if you know?
Ah, it would be exciting if I knew that question.
Okay, I didn't
Uh,
know. I just didn't know.
I wanna say 500 miles, maybe more,
Okay, I was gonna say
at
maybe a little
least
bit more.
500.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow,
I mean,
that's
it
amazing.
depends on, if you're taking it from Nevada or if you're taking it from Idaho, but
That's true.
yeah.
Wow. Well, I can tell you what, the reason I know it's not that popular is on my Apple Watch. I'm doing a thing called the Oregon Trail Walk, okay? There's no Applegate Trail app that I can use to trudge the Applegate Trail. So I'm walking to Oregon. I'm not getting too far too fast, but oh my. Tell me, there was a major brouhaha between some people here, between a guy named, let me get to read this, J. Quinn Thornton and James W. Nesmith. There was a major brouhaha about this trail and everything else. Tell us a little bit about what that was all about back in the 1800s.
So, that brouhaha is part of why you've never heard of the trail, because it's still playing out today. The descendants of these people are still sorting this history out. It remains contested. I mean, it's really wild. So the Applegates went east from the Willamette Valley, east and south through what we call the Siskiyou Mountains and out into Nevada. And they had a company of 15 men. And 15 men when you're trying to cut a hundreds of miles long trail over rugged terrain that should be passable, like passable for 15 men versus passable for 200 wagons plus like pregnant women, small children, cattle, goats, all of those things are different. And so we know that the company, the Applegate company, safely made it themselves to the Humboldt Sink and were able to make it to Fort Hall, and that it was passable for that company of 15 men. At that point, history diverges on what exactly transpired and what the motivations were of the people. The best understanding that I have of it is that miscommunication, bad luck, and the nature of the trail itself conspired to make it nearly impossible for the first group of people who followed the Applegates, then westward from Fort Hall, to navigate safely in time for one of the heaviest snowstorm winters that that portion of the trail had really ever seen. And it's interesting that we're having this conversation because it was the year that the Donner family got snowed in on Donner Pass, and just a couple of days ago there were images, in the news of, people in cars and trucks stranded at Donner Pass. So, this is something that happens in this place. But one of those people, Thornton, um, really disliked his experience on the trail.
That's putting it mildly.
He really disliked it, and he lost all of his possessions, and he was a vocal man, and he was described as irascible and some other fancy words for being cantankerous. And he got to Oregon and he made his displeasure known in the newspapers and in bulletins and singing from the hilltops, presumably. And he blamed the Applegates and he called them grifters, and he implied that they had tried to lure him into this life-threatening situation, and he did this for like a really long time. And eventually, uh, the Applegates had people that were loyal to them, and somebody challenged him to a duel, which I love, which I absolutely love. And what I love is that the duel never took place because the Applegates were more than just road hunters. They were members of the burgeoning government, and one of them had already introduced anti-dueling legislation.
Oh my. Oh
And so it
my.
sort of worked itself out, coming round full circle. And Thornton survived and contributed Oregon's state motto to history. She flies on her own wings, or something very similar to that. So he has his own mark in history. And yeah.
Wow, that's really something. We're talking about wilderness, and there's a lot that goes on the wilderness. But one of the major people when you talk about wilderness is a gentleman. Again, a lot of people might not have heard of Gifford Pinchot. And he's a very big part about the wilderness, the Forest Service, and everything else. Tell us a little bit about him. And I think he was at one time a devotee of John Muir, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, Gifford Pinchot. There's a national forest in the state of Washington, named after him. He was really the first administrative figure in the federal government that applied the philosophy of what we understand as conservation efforts, like sort of 20th century conservation efforts, to the American West and the American landscape in general. And he did that at this sort of pivotal moment when the frontier was closing in the late 1800s, and um, a lot of the West was newly developed, because we were 50 years post gold rush, and there was a real sense that for the first time that the United States might run out of land and run out of resources. And so Pinchot really brought that sense into the administration and the administrative efforts, and helped form the modern USGS and the modern Forest Service and all of these modern institutions that we have that now do things like provide us with legal definitions of wilderness and provide us with a framework for how citizens of the United States engage with, benefit from, and are restricted from natural spaces. And he did so with a real eye towards value, um, which is has been very which has been a useful tool.
Right, right. I think he was appointed, was he not, by Teddy Roosevelt? Didn't Roosevelt put him the head of the Forestry Service? He
I
got his.
think so, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So it's that same sort of cohort. There was really a movement at that time towards there was a lot of very famous, mostly male figures, because those were who were voting, and who were in office. But I'm sure also the sentiment of, lots of very smart and competent women as well. That, towards that. And I think that what Pinchot was able to do was to gather that together and articulate it, and then turn that into policy in a way that made both the public and the stakeholders happy, and that was a real gift.
Okay. And yet at the same time, again, and I certainly haven't studied this like you have, isn't he around the first one to allow them to come in and do sort of a controlled timbering and everything else on the national forest land?
This is one of the first questions where you say, well, what is wilderness? And then the next question after that is, how do we use it? What purpose does it serve um, for humanity? And then the next piece is, what rights and responsibilities do we have if we're going to use this, because we clearly rely upon it. And so those earliest days of the Forest Service administration, and were really they were interested in using resources and managing them in an economic way, in part because at the end of the 19th century, the United States was in sort of a recession, and it wasn't kind of was in need of an economic stimulus, and it was a catch 22. We had all these resources, we didn't really have a market for them, and there was sort of need to regulate that so that you wouldn't have get caught into an endless cycle of boom and bust, and so a lot of it was really addressing the needs of the time.
Okay. All right. Good. All right. Now, a couple other people come across in your book, but I love this. Buster Keaton shows up on the Applegate Trail. Where does Buster show up, and how does he fit into this whole story? Because this is fantastic, this story. Tell us a little about Buster Keaton's adventures on the Applegate Trail.
Yeah, in the 1920s, Buster Keaton was the biggest movie star. He was the biggest movie star. He wasn't just a movie star, he was a movie maker, he was a director, he was a producer, he was a triple threat, well, we don't know if he could sing because it was still silent films, but he came out of vaudeville. His parents were vaudevillians, and he was the biggest star of his age in a lot of respects. And he ended up filming a movie called The General in Cottage Grove, Oregon, which is along the Applegate Trail, just south of Eugene, where I am right now. And he, it's The General is about a Civil War movie about a great train chase that's a true story that took place. There was a train chase that took place during the Civil War where basically the Union soldiers were able to stop the stealing of their provisions and supplies by the South. And there's this whole intrigue that goes on. And it is a great story. And so Buster Keaton, he loved the story. He needed to film it someplace where they had old fashioned tracks, they had old fashioned trains. And they found Oregon because nobody in the South wanted to film it because it was still in the post Civil War era. And Buster had flipped the script and made the Union Army the villains and the Confederate Army the victors. So he flipped the history. It was all true except for the fact that he flipped which side was which, and he made it a little bit of a Civil War revisionist story. But when he came, and Oregon, like Oregon didn't have the Civil War happen on its grounds. I think it was people's perspectives on that kind of content was different. When he showed up, he played baseball and he cooked and he entertained and he sang songs. And, he everybody in the town was in the movie and they were there for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And they filmed over and over and over again. And he did all these great stunts and the movie was a flop.
Yeah. At the
and
time.
and pe-
At the time.
at the
Yeah.
time, at the time, the movie flopped. And now, in hindsight, people look back on it and they see that, particularly cinematically, that there was a real genius to what he was doing and the stunts and all of that. But it was the beginning of a sort of very sad decline for him, which is something of a theme, an accidental theme of the book, the beginning of a very sad decline.
So Oregon takes the place of, I think, Georgia or something like that in this book, and in reality, and we had no idea about that when we watched the movie. I learned that. Another guy comes across, Dick Dale. Now this guy's another fascinating individual. Dick Dale was on the Mickey Mouse Club, if I'm not mistaken, and eventually made his way
Dennis
up to
Day.
Dennis Day. That Dick Dale. What a moron I am. Dennis Day. Ay, 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 Dick Dale. Too many D's. Okay, Dennis Dale was on the Mickey Mouse Club and makes his way up to the Applegate Trail also. What was his claim to fame?
Yeah, in 2018, if you turn on the news, you in Oregon, you might have run across a story where they said, former Mouseketeer Dennis Day is missing from his home in Phoenix, Oregon. And I'm from Oregon, and I go to a lot of places in Oregon, and I was like, we have a Mouseketeer living in Oregon, and nobody knew about it. And then I thought, where is Phoenix, Oregon? Like, I've never heard of that place. And then I thought, why do we have a Mouseketeer that's missing from Phoenix, Oregon? And he remained missing for a long time. And it took a really long time to sort out what happened. He'd moved there. He'd been in the Mouseketeers in the first batch of Mouseketeers. I mean, these like the first kids to ever wear mouse ears. They were icons of culture. And then, he'd gone to San Francisco and done sort of like the bohemian artist's life. He made his way up finally to Oregon, and then he was an old man and living out his life with his husband, and he up and disappeared. And
He was a white Mickey Mouse Club guy. There were different levels of being in the Mickey Mouse Club. There were red Mickey Mouse, blue Mickey Mouse, white Mickey Mouse, which I guess meant he was talented, but not that talented.
yeah, I mean, I think that Disney was not messing around with those Mouseketeers, and I think that those kids had talent and ambition, and I think that, ranking them and putting them into groups probably really motivated them. And yeah, so he gave one of the first interviews as a young adult, in Rolling Stone, that, sort of any of the grown-up Mouseketeers had given, and talked about being post mouse and smoking marijuana and all of the risque things that he shouldn't have done. And um, I think I think it was considered very shocking at the time. I think now we're kind of used to the concept of Disney stars and what they become when they're done being Disney stars. But back then, I think that there was an expectation that that was like who they were forever. Um, and so, when he disappeared under really tragic circumstances, and later his body was found, um, in his own home, it, to me, spoke to the ways in which, Oregonians and collectively sort of the larger American culture takes care of our artists, takes care of our communities and our old people, and ultimately how we take care of ourselves and the bodies of, our vulnerable populations, is reflective of how we take care of the natural world. And so that's how his story, made it into the book, because I saw it as an allegory, um, for other things that we have taken care of or not taken care of along the Applegate Trail.
We're running out of time. I got a couple more questions for you. The first one I want to ask you is about, you make a point that you think some of the mainstream conservation and environmental groups, their basis is to compromise with the government, and that you think that they are racist. Did I read that correctly?
Let me put it this way. I would say that it is widely accepted in the world of environmental advocacy these days that, um, has been and continues to be things that are inherently problematic, um, about the conservation effort, and primarily because of its dominance, by white people. And I also think that environmental advocacy groups have been very forthright in, acknowledging the institutional racism that exists. For instance, the Portland Audubon Society recently dropped Audubon from their name and became something that I cannot remember because of this very issue, because of Audubon's previous statements on race, and behavior in that. And so I want to be sure that it's not my condemnation, but what it is I'm participating in a generalized, and really necessary correction of something that was inherent and systemic, in part because, of traditional access to wilderness areas being, more easily attained by people who are white than and sort of mainstream normative people than anyone who's marginalized. And that's for economic reasons, and that's for location reasons, and that's for urbanization reasons. Um, and environmental groups do compromise, and they have to, and they have to. Um, and it's important to recognize that the compromises are happening, right? I mean, it's really important to recognize what you're gaining and to keep track of those compromises and to make sure that you are reevaluating compromises as you get new information, as new generations come in and their value systems change, as, climate changes, as resource availability changes, as the needs of the people change. And so one of the things that we do need to scrutinize is what worked in, the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and when we were in a place of warning about some environmental consequences, versus what will work now when we are clearly in a place of consequence. And should we just de facto make the same kinds of compromises, or do the nature of our compromises need to change based on our new current situation?
I'll tell you, as a proud subscriber to True West magazine, when I open up those things, they always show pictures. Oh, here's another party coming out west to look at this. I gotta be honest with you, never saw any blacks, never saw Hispanics on those trains. Always a lot of white women were there though. They brought the women out and they wonderful. So yeah, very interesting. Now, I listen, we gotta get to this. And I don't know why I kept this for last. Bald Mountain. Bald Mountain is a fascinating, fascinating thing. You got around 3 minutes. Can you condense everything into 3 minutes to tell us about Bald Mountain?
Yeah, in the 1980s, Lou Gold and a bunch of other dudes stood and locked elbows in front of a bulldozer in literally the middle of nowhere Oregon forests and said, "You will not build this road. You will not log these trees." And the bulldozer operator got really angry, and the protesters held their ground, and it started years of battles, on the ground battles between forest protectors and people who are boots on the ground who make their living procuring those natural resources for the use in our homes that eventually ended up being resolved by the Clinton administration in the Northwest Forest Plan and the protection of the northern spotted owl and the implementation of the Endangered Species Act in the way that it is currently implemented today, which is as a potent tool for the protection of habitat, not just species, recognizing that land is connected to animals.
But it
That's the best I can
also
do in 3 minutes.
okay, that's good. But it also allowed for what I think you wrote 24 million acres to now be subject to logging or timberling, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring that up. The Northwest Forest Plan is undergoing its first major revision since its implementation in 1994, right now as we speak. So we don't know what will come of that, but it speaks to the point that I was making just now, where the federal government has recognized that times have changed and value systems have changed, and that we need to start reevaluating some of this policy based on where we are now.
I hope you trust the government more than I do, because I don't see those guys in Washington be able to figure out if it's daylight saving time or standard time anymore. I don't know. It's I. Anyway, there are too many important things. Hey, one of the things that people didn't realize, this area was actually, I think, bombed or firebombed by the Japanese in World War II.
Mhm. Yeah, they sent, like, balloon bombs over. They were thinking that if they could start a forest fire, that would be, like, a really good form of, like, terrorizing the public, which, having lived through the 2020 fires that we had, the mega fires, it is a good way of terrorizing the public, and you do feel it is fear invoking. And, it is a testament to the very best of the Forest Service that it was a Forest Service lookout that spotted it, that hiked out, that sent up the alarm, and that ultimately quenched the biggest of those fires that would have had the potential to do that. But every so often, they still find like remnants from that in the forest because there's just a lot of land out there. You never know what you're gonna find in the Oregon forest.
That's right. That's really something. I was telling somebody about that last night, and they never knew that. And I said, "Well, did you know that the Japanese had invaded Alaska and actually had held a couple islands?" No, yeah, I said, a lot went on there. We didn't always tell us that at the time, but wow, that's a fascinating little tie-in there. That's just wonderful. Now, hey, listen, what's next for Ruby McConnell? Because I have a feeling there's going to be a few more projects coming up for you.
I am working on a book for Basic Books, which is an imprint of Hachette, loosely titled Dirty Secrets, that is about soil and groundwater contamination in the United States, and the shape of that and what we can do to fix it, because it's nice to write about an environmental problem that has solutions.
It has a solution. Well, that's great. Are you a full-time writer now?
I'm a full-time writer.
Okay, good. No, no longer out in the field doing tromping around in your boots and going to see all the geological formations you have out there, huh?
That's what I call writing. What are you
Okay.
talking? I mean, I I put the ground under my feet before
Good
I
for
write
you.
about these places.
Good for
It's
you.
rare that I write about a place that I haven't walked myself.
That's great. You know, you've been wonderful, been delightful. Thank you so much today, Ruby McConnell, for coming on Books and Looks.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Friends, we'll be right back. Well, thank you again, Ruby. That was just a delightful interview, and I hope all of you enjoyed it as much as I have. I'll tell you what, there's something about the great outdoors that, I don't get out that much anymore because I'm physically not able to do that much. But I'll tell you what, there's something about it that if you get out there, you don't want to miss it. And that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the great outdoors. Whether you live in the east or the south and you have to go to, maybe you're in the Blue Ridge Parkway, maybe you go to the Smoky Mountains, maybe you go up to up to New York, maybe you go up there to the Catskills, in that area, that region of the area. There's great outdoors. There's wilderness area that for us to enjoy. You cross the Mississippi, you go out to those national parks. That's what I'm looking at, folks. I'm looking at those areas. Bryce, Zion, Grand Canyon, been there, love them. Wish I could go again. Maybe one day I will. But if you can, folks, go. Go yourself. Take this summer or take next summer and go out and enjoy America. There's so much to learn. There's so much to see. And make sure if you get a chance to go on that Applegate Trail, as Ruby McConnell took us on her book. So anyway, on behalf of viewsonbooks.com, on behalf of my good friends at Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks saying, may all your pages be leaves in a book.